Hello and welcome to Unity Presbyterian Church Online. This week in worship, Pastor David takes a look at the church as a family. What's your family like? And what's the perfect family like? Let's listen.
Well, as we mentioned today, we're in this new sermon series where we're studying the metaphors of the church as described in the Bible. And so today we are studying how is the church like a family. So think about that for a second. How is the church like a family? And maybe to start thinking that direction, think about what does your own family look like? The family system that you are a part of. To get you thinking in that direction, I will show you my family. Here's a picture of my family. Now, this was a picture that was taken about 10 years, maybe 15, maybe longer. So young and youthful in that picture. But these are my brothers. I'm a middle child. On the right is my older brother, in the middle is my younger brother, and then there is me. And now, before you start thinking about it, no, I'm not your stereotypical middle child. I'm very well adjusted, although I did have to keep the peace between the brothers a lot growing up. And so if you were to ask me, well, describe your family, this is one of the ways that I would describe my family system. I would tell you about my brothers. But that's not quite accurate, is it? Or maybe accurate's not the best word. Maybe it's not a complete picture of my family. This is also my family. So these are my daughters. You've probably either met them or seen them simply running around the church like they own the place. But on the left is my older daughter, Zoe, middle child, Riley, on the right, and then right in the middle is Gemma. This is on her third birthday from 2 weeks ago. If you've seen Gemma around, she almost always has her thumb stuck in her mouth as she's just taking on the world around her. She did the same thing during her birthday when all the attention was focused on her. She had a little smile. You could tell she enjoyed it, but she was just taking it in. This is also my family. I'm a father. I'm a father of 3 kids. I'm a husband. I've been married to Sarah now for 16 years. You also have all these different roles, don't you, in your family systems? Grandparents, parents, husband, wife, brother, sister, cousin, uncle. The list can go on and on. But even these pictures are not totally complete. Not a complete picture of what family is. Now, there's one more picture that I want to show you. This is family. This was taken several years ago during the church retreat up to the mountains, up to Montreat. It was one of those beautiful but really cold November weekends where the peak colors lasted later into the season. And so that particular weekend, I think it was the second week in November, everything in the mountains was yellow and orange and beautiful. And I still remember bonding with the church family, of the conversations that we had late into the night and throughout the day about what it meant to be a church, what it meant to follow God. This is the image that I want you to keep in your heads today as we talk about family, as we talk about the family of faith, because God says that when you're a part of a church, it's not like any other organization out there in the world. When you're a part of a church, you are a part of a family. Now, why does Jesus say that? Why do we believe that? Well, it comes from this story that I want to begin our discussion of together. It's a story of Jesus, and he's with his 12 disciples, and he was about to have a meal with them. So he was in a home where he was hosted for this meal. They had sat down to get ready for it, but then people started streaming in the door. They just were coming in hoping that they could learn something from Jesus. This story happened early on in Jesus' ministry where people are still learning. Who is Jesus? There's something about him that we want to know more about. More and more people continue to stream into the house to the point that Jesus just gives up on the meal. He says, okay, that's fine. We're not going to eat right now. I will teach. And so he stands up. He starts teaching people in the house. At this point, it's standing room only. So many people want to hear from Jesus. And then his mother comes, his mother Mary, and some of his brothers come as well. But it's so crowded in the house that they can't make it through to see Jesus. That's where our story is going to begin. And I want you to pay particular attention to how Jesus uses this story to teach us about family. Okay, we begin in Mark chapter 3, verse 31. Then Jesus' mother and brothers arrived, and standing outside, they sent someone in to call him. A crowd was sitting around him, and they told him, "Your mother and brothers are outside looking for you." Now, if I was Jesus, I would probably excuse myself so I could go talk with my mom, talk with my brothers, see what it is that they needed. That would be the polite thing to do, wouldn't it? But Jesus does something different. Jesus uses this as an opportunity to teach everybody that was present that day about a deeper reality of family and what family really looks like. So here's what happens next. Jesus says, "Who are my mother and who are my brothers?" Now, again, if I was sitting in that crowd, I would probably wonder to myself, was this a trick question? I mean, of course Jesus knows who his family is. I mean, they're just right outside the house. But Jesus, of course, is asking a rhetorical question. And rhetorical questions are not meant to be answered. They are designed to get you to think more deeply about the topic at hand. In this case, Jesus wants everyone who was present that day to think more deeply about what constitutes a family. Who are my mother? Who are my brothers? He asks. So, if someone were to ask you, what constitutes your family? What does a family look like? Well, how would you answer that? You could probably answer that in many different ways. One of my first impressions, thoughts of how to answer that would probably be to think about, well, who are my biological family members? And I would think about the people that I'm related to, the people that I share genes with. But then, as I continued to think about family, I'd realize, well, that's probably too narrow. That's probably too restrictive. Because even in my own immediate family, 2 of my daughters are adopted. We don't share any genetics or biology. And yet, they are still family. And so I'd need to expand that view. I'd say, okay, well, I'm sure you can all think of someone in your life that you're not related to, but you've gone through the ups and downs of life together. That person has been there for you when you deeply needed them. If someone were to ask, you'd probably call them family. You see, when we start thinking about our family, it becomes broader most times than what we might initially think about when we ask that question. Jesus wants us to think even more broadly about what it means to be family. Here's how he answers his own question. Then he looked at those seated in a circle around him and said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does God's will is my brother and sister and mother." So Jesus has just given us a very broad and a very inclusive view of family. Whoever does God's will is a part of Jesus' family. Now, the early Christians in the first century took this very seriously. So they began to call one another in the church brother and sister, which very much confused the wider culture around Rome. I mean, Rome was seeing this church that had just appeared on the scene out of nowhere. And this church included people from a variety of different backgrounds, different ethnicities, different socioeconomic statuses. And here they were calling one another brother and sister. And Rome is seeing this going, what is going on? What is this church all about? But it is because they took this teaching of Jesus very seriously. And they viewed their fellow Christians, anyone else who did the will of God, as family members. Whoever does God's will is my brother and my sister. My favorite Christmas carol, probably of all time, is "O Holy Night." This is a good time to tell you that as of today, there are only 129 more days until Christmas. It's time to get shopping. which also means that fall is just a little bit closer. I'm probably even more excited for that and for cooler weather. But in O Holy Night, there's this line, and it has stuck in my head since the very first time that I heard that hymn. It was a deeply spiritual and deeply moving line that has stuck with me in such a way that every Christmas, it doesn't feel complete until I sing it at some point. It comes from the third verse when it says this: "Chains shall he break, for the slave is our brother, and in his name all oppression shall cease." Now, this song was originally written in 1843 by a poet in France, but it didn't really gain popularity until an American abolitionist, someone who was working to end slavery, he heard that song. And particularly, he heard that third verse and was so moved at the idea of viewing all of those who were enslaved as his brother that he brought that song back to America. And it became incredibly popular. I mean, so much today that we're still singing it most every Christmas, aren't we? It became almost a rallying cry of the early American abolitionists because it teaches us something so powerful. It speaks to the power of Christians seeing all other Christians as if they were brothers and sisters. And it doesn't matter if that person is a slave. They are still your brother. And as such, we must treat them as if they were family. We must work against oppression like we would with our very own brother. Now, remember, with all of these teachings, we are seeking to not only learn about the church universal, but we're seeking to apply it right here to our church community. So, what have we learned so far? Well, Unity Presbyterian Church, we are a family of faith, which means that we seek to care for each other, just like we would our very own families. Now, I recognize that not all of us come from really good family backgrounds or family systems, but for a moment, I want you to picture what the perfect family might look like. If you were asked, okay, here are the traits, here are the qualities of what make up a really perfect family, what sort of traits and qualities would you write? Well, here's what I thought about this week. I thought it is a family where a deep level of trust can be shared with one another, where you can openly share anything, you can be vulnerable with one another, and know that it's going to be free of judgment, it's going to be free of any sideways glances. I think it is a family that people cooperate with one another, right? At times, that means it's me voluntarily giving up what I want so that someone else in the family system can thrive. Or, as we told one of our daughters, no, that means you can't do gymnastics every day of the week. Sometimes your siblings want a chance to play sports too, right? In families, we share. In families, we take turns. In a family, we seek to do what is best for one another. We don't compete with one another, but we cooperate and support one another. And as people end up hurting our feelings from time to time, which happens in families probably more than most other areas or systems, we come to each other in forgiveness, in reconciliation. We don't hold grudges against people. Now, this is probably a good time to remind ourselves that no family is perfect. There is not a perfect family out there, but I think we all have a sense of what we want to be striving to in the families that we are a part of. Well, everything that I just listed are the types of things that Jesus wants to see within the church, because the church is the family of God. Okay, so we have this concept. We're starting out by Jesus saying this is a family that we are a part of. Paul takes that concept and he applies it specifically to one church, to a church in Galatia. And he says, here, as the family of faith, this is one way that you, in your context, can really live that out. So that's what I want to study next. I want to study what Paul says to this particular church in Galatia. Galatians chapter 6, Paul says this: let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially to those who belong in the family of faith. So what did Paul just teach us there? Well, I think one thing Paul taught us is that in the family of faith, we do good to all people. I know our church doesn't have one of those signs where if you're driving by, you can write out a message. But if we did, this would be the message that I would want to write. Unity Presbyterian Church, we do good to all people. Oh, wouldn't that be an amazing slogan? Wouldn't that be amazing if people around the world, when they thought of church, that's what they thought of. They thought, oh, that's a place that does good to all people. I mean, that's why when someone stops by the church and they are seeking help with rent or an electric bill, we seek to do what we can to help them, whether or not they've ever been to this church before. It doesn't matter if they are a member. It doesn't matter if we know them. If they are coming and they're in a place of need, we say, okay, what can we do to help? I remember once someone came to the office and they were looking for help. And so the receptionist brought her back to meet with me, and I talked with her and I asked her a bit about her story. And she said, I just didn't know where to turn. And so I was driving down this road and I saw the church steeple and I thought maybe I'll turn there. I was so glad she did, because that was this idea that, hey, the church is a symbol of a place that's going to help anybody. And maybe I can find help there as well. This is what Paul wants us as a family system to be working towards. I mean, I think every family has their own goals, right? Their own things that they're working towards. This is the goal of the family of faith. We do good to all people. But did you notice that Paul also asks for a special effort to be made to help those within the family of faith? Now, this makes sense because in first century Rome, when a person became a Christian, they were largely cut off from the marketplace. At times, they were isolated and rejected, which made it much harder to make a living. So Paul wants to make sure that people in the church, they care for one another. They help each other out, even if the larger society in Rome was not being helpful. Well, I think today, 2,000 years later, we still hold these dual focuses, where we are very focused on doing good in our community and to the wider world around us, right? We help refugees in Ukraine, women in India, and people looking for assistance right here in Denver. That's one focus. But the second focus is that we also seek to help one another right here in this church. We hold each other in prayer during times of grief. We send cards and cook meals for people after surgery. We share meals together once a week on Wednesday nights as a meal of fellowship. Because as a family of faith, I think we must always keep these dual focuses in the front of our mind. Now, to this end, did you notice that Paul did have one very important contingency in his words? He had the phrase, as we have the opportunity. So we are to do good to all people inside and outside of our community as we have the opportunity. You see, Paul's realistic. When we start talking about doing good to all people, that can quickly become a daunting prospect. We might think, really, Paul, like all people, that's a high bar. How can I possibly do that? And sometimes when you're faced with a really, really big challenge and you don't know how to start, you might say, well, I'm just going to give up, right? I can't help all people, and so I'm just not even going to start. But Paul makes it clear that while we cannot physically help every person on earth, we can and should help those with whom we have the opportunity. I believe that God will place you in situations where you alone can help. That God will give you opportunities where a need is presented to you specifically. Yes, you can't help everyone, but you can help the person in front of you, the person that God places in your life. I once heard one pastor sum this up really well. He said, "Do for one what you wish you could do for everyone." That's really the marching orders from Paul here. We want to help everyone, but we can't. And so we can help the one that God places in front of us. That's true for our particular families, and that's true for our family of faith as well. Now, as Paul was talking about all of this, I'm sure he thought that there were going to be some people going, "Ooh, I don't know if I'd fit in that family." I mean, maybe in your own family you go, "I'm the black sheep. I don't know if I really fit within this family system." And Paul knew that there would be people who felt like that in the church. And so how can the church say, "Hey, we're a welcoming family. We want anyone to be a part of this church," knowing that some people look at the church from the outside going, "I don't know if I'd really fit there. I don't know if I'd feel like family." So he actually goes to speak about this topic next. And he speaks particularly to a church in Ephesus, because this church in Ephesus was a blending together of Gentiles and Jews. Now, remember, before Jesus, there were Jews and then everybody else, right? Gentiles were anybody outside of the church. And so Gentiles often felt like they were the outsiders, like they were the ones who would never be welcomed into that community. But in Jesus brought everyone together. Jesus brought Jews and Gentiles into one place. But Paul recognized that's going to be a challenge because they come from very different backgrounds. Think of Jewish people, where a Jew was taught the Torah from a very young age. They were taught to memorize the 10 Commandments and to learn how to follow God. And a Gentile, they didn't have any of that background. It would be coming to a church for the very first time, never growing up in the church, and just having to learn everything all at once for the first time. That would be an intimidating prospect, wouldn't it? And so Paul thought about these two groups coming together, and he said, "You know what? I've got a message for the Gentiles. I've got a message for anyone who feels like maybe I wouldn't fit into that family. Anyone who feels like maybe I'm an outsider to that church system." And here's what he had to say in Ephesians chapter 2. He says, "So now you Gentiles are no longer strangers and foreigners. You are citizens along with all God's holy people. You are members of God's family." Okay, so I love this. And I love this for a couple of reasons. But one of the reasons I love this is Paul is acknowledging how they must have felt when they were invited into church for the first time. They felt like strangers. They felt like foreigners. They felt like the outsiders. But he said, "I'm changing your identity. You are no longer a stranger. You are now a citizen," right? You are no longer a foreigner. You are now a member of God's family. That's who you are when you come now to the new Christian church. And that's what we want for anyone who comes in these doors. Anyone, no matter the background that they have, we want them to feel like a member of God's family. So, like we always do, let's apply this to us. I mean, these were Paul's words to the Gentiles, but let's apply this to unity today. I recognize when I look out at the church that we are not all alike, are we? No, we come from different backgrounds. We have our own unique beliefs about God, how we were raised, what our feelings are about God. We probably have certain ideas about faith and what is true. And just like in your own family, you may be quite different from your brothers and sisters or cousins, but you're still family, aren't you? I think that's why this metaphor is so powerful. Paul is saying it doesn't matter how different you are. When you come here, you are still family. You are still a part of the family of God, and so are we, right here in Unity, part of the family of faith. And so I don't want you, when you come here, to think that you have to act a certain way, to blend in, or to pretend to be a certain way because you're here at the church. No, I want you to be who you are, to be who God created you to be, and then feel the warmth and the acceptance of what it is like to be a part of the family of faith. This is the metaphor that God has given us today, and that's how I want everyone to feel when they walk through these doors. Amen.
If you would like more information about Unity Presbyterian Church, please visit our website at www.unitypres.org or visit us on Facebook. This is the Unity Presbyterian Church podcast. Have a great week.